The following program is a production of the Hennepin County Library.
Hello, and welcome to a discussion with Jack Trimpey. My name is Mike Anderegg, and I am active with Rational Recovery of Minnesota. Today we have with us Jack Trimpey, who is Executive Director and founder of Rational Recovery Systems of California. Rational Recovery is a secular group, self-help and self-recovery group for persons with substance abuse problems, and it's the only nationwide alternative currently available to Alcoholics Anonymous. Jack, can you give us a little bit of a background on how you got the idea to start Rational Recovery and some of the basis for the organization?
Well, I got the idea for Rational Recovery quite a while after I myself got better from alcohol dependence back in the, about 10 years ago, which would have been 1980, 81, 82 when I got better. After I had been pretty clear for a while, I noticed that many of the people that I saw as a clinical social worker professionally had similar experiences as I had in not wanting or not being able to accept the teachings, the spiritual teachings of Alcoholics Anonymous. So it came to me at that point that there's a desperate need for something other than the 12-step approach for chemically dependent people.
Right. Well, it's my understanding that your book, the small book, is based on work previously done by Albert Ellis, who's a PhD and is called Rational Emotive Therapy. Maybe you could give us a little bit of information on that before we start exploring differences between your program and
the small book, which has just come out in the hardback edition by Delacorte, was actually a manuscript that was passed around at meetings of Rational Recovery when they first started in California. And that was back in about 86, 87, during that period of time. And finally, my wife Lois and I self-published the manuscript and titled it then The Small Book. And for about 3 or 4 years, it was a self-published book that we just simply distributed to our groups. Rational Recovery is based on RET, Rational Emotive Therapy, which was developed by Dr. Albert Ellis. This RET is taught in most universities. It's quite a potent means for personal change. It's the basis of a psychotherapy. What we are doing is delivering a self-help version for people who are not necessarily in therapy, but are attempting to defeat an addiction to chemicals.
Okay, this is, it sounds a little bit intimidating or complicated for a person who might not be familiar with the idea. Is this something that's readily applied by lay people or non-professionals to their own addiction problems?
Certainly, children catch on quite readily. In fact, to some extent, children make up RET. We've heard the expression, sticks and stones will break my bones. Well, that's straight RET. As much as can be delivered by a professional person, that concept that I don't have to be so worried about what people think about me or say about me, but I would be concerned about being physically harmed. That would be a very rational idea. Also, don't cry over spilled milk is another homily, but it's quite rational, and people can learn that they don't need to disturb themselves because something that unfortunate has happened. So Rational Recovery is a way for people to learn to control their moods and emotions by what they think, rather than by what they drink or inject in their bloodstream or stick up their noses.
Okay, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the key differences between rational recovery, the ways of thinking in rational recovery, and the ways of thinking in traditional 12-step programs such as AA?
The key difference is, well, there's a couple of them. One is the spiritual quality. Rational recovery is non-spiritual, which means it's based on scientific thinking, and it calls upon people's intelligence and their ability to apply reason to the problems of addiction and personal unhappiness. But another very important difference is that when people are better from an addiction, they're better. And we don't see a reason to continue recovering long after we have stopped drinking and learned to feel good, to achieve our goals and have fun without alcohol. So we're very interested in people moving along, leaving our groups, and naturally they would be welcome to return, but we don't want people to live out their lives in a therapeutic setting, and we don't want them to waste sobriety on more recovery when it's over.
Well, that sounds to me then like a dramatic departure from the information that recovering people would be supplied by AA.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's a more hopeful approach to many people. Now, some people, when they hear about AA, are really turned on. They like the idea of the social connection. They like the idea of having a structure to their lives. To us, it looks like AA structures their lives around alcohol or the avoidance of it, but that is neither here nor there. So many people like that. Rational recovery is for people who are different in their attitudes and their perceptions and their feelings about things, and we are inclined to use reason rather than faith as a compass when we have difficulties in life. That's how we function. Up until rational recovery, there simply was no program for people who disagreed with the spiritual teachings of AA, and a very unfortunate thing happened. What happened was that AA made a transition from being a voluntary program of people who just wanted to stop drinking and lead a better life into a program that began to claim to be universal for all people, and in doing so they began to interpret objections to the 12-step approach as disease. Like, if you don't accept that you're powerless, then that's part of your illness. And this is a very deeply frustrating predicament for people to get into when they are not equipped or suited for surrender, which is required in the 12-step program, and then their strengths are called disease. That's why it's very important to have the two parties now in addiction care, much in the same way that we have the Republicans and Democrats, you know.
Very interesting. I think I'd like to ask you a little bit about, I think you're referring in a lot of this discussion to the first step, which teaches people that they are indeed powerless over alcohol, and that once they begin to drink, that there is no way for them to stop, and they'll ultimately end up dead if they do not completely abstain, and furthermore abstain through the 12-step program.
Yeah.
And as a recovering person in the state of Minnesota, where the Minnesota model and the 12-step model are very dominant, I have heard many times that I must be in denial and out of touch with reality, and that there's only one way to get better. And I would be interested in what your response to people would be who might use that line of reasoning with you.
Well, it happens all the time. If I'm in Minnesota, I feel like a Yankee in the heart of Dixie, because this is really a very prevalent 12-step community. And to some extent, this condition exists everywhere else in the nation, and that's how rational recovery now is rising to meet the demand for a distinct alternative from that. But the experience that you've had with people calling you in denial over this powerlessness, or any other step for that matter, is an interesting one, because in all of our years now of experience with rational recovery, we aren't finding people who are in denial. This seems to be an artifact of the 12-step philosophy much more than an idea that has any clinical usefulness to say that people are in denial. Our question is, well, if they're in denial, how could they get to one of our groups, which are very clearly advertised as being for people with chemical dependency problems? They're obviously aware that they have a problem with alcohol. When they get in the groups, they may make further attempts to moderate. These are not recognized as being valid in AA, but we think that it's very important that people make really serious efforts to moderate so that they can learn the limits of their body and then choose to abstain based on real practical experience, first-hand experience, rather than accepting on faith what others are telling them, that they have this disease and they can never, never, never have at least a little drop or they'll fall dead. So it's more of a program for people who ask questions, they want to experiment, they want to find out for themselves. We question authority, we won't be told what to do, and like in my case, I frankly would rather be drunk than to go to an extended commitment to a 12-step recovery.
Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on, I know that you have a section in the book that talks about the philosophies or the ways of thinking of alcoholism in the traditional 12-step program versus the ways of thinking about addiction or problems in rational recovery. We've talked a little bit about powerlessness. And
yeah, now many people come to recovery with an awful lot of guilt, shame, or a lot of bad feelings about themselves on account of this pervasive pattern of failure that's been caused by being intoxicated or drunk. So they come to recovery, both AA and RR, and the reason for wanting to stop drinking very often is so that I can get some self-respect, so that I can get some self-esteem. I want to build self-esteem, and I think maybe after I'm sober for 3 months, then I'll begin to feel a little better about myself. We raised some very serious questions about that and challenged the idea that drunk people are less worthwhile than sober people. And we favor, or we help people to attempt to start feeling worthwhile and have self-esteem right now, before we even stop drinking. One of the old sayings that we start to hear in RR is better a self-respecting drunk than a guilty one, because it's the self-respecting ones that usually go on to get better. So there are some very fundamental differences, I think point for point, right down through the 12 steps and right across the broad bodies of literature behind AA and RR. There's philosophical contradiction right across the board.
Very interesting. So you, sounds to me like you're saying that people can feel okay about themselves and have self-esteem regardless of the fact that they've recently been having difficulties, whether it be substance abuse or any other sorts of difficulties.
Yeah, and not because of it either. I'm not saying that because I'm a drunk I would feel good about myself. I've even heard that a few times, by the way. People say, well, alcoholics are very special people. We're very creative and bright and intelligent, and that's not quite it. But in spite of our failings, in spite of our fallibility and things that we've done that are harmful, many people coming to recovery have harmed or even killed people. So we're dealing with very serious problems of self-hatred, self-damnation, self-condemnation, and we think that it's very important that a person not get out on thin ice and say, in order for me to feel good about myself, I must not drink, because the first time that there's some irregularity, then the ice will break and down we go into a new level of hopelessness and despair. So we hope that people, if and when they do relapse, would not use that as yet another opportunity to excoriate themselves or put themselves down and feel rotten, because the cycle then goes on and on and on.
Okay. I think that your program advances, one of the ideas you advance is that a lot of people that are using substances are doing so to alleviate or help medicate certain feelings which they are feeling are intolerable or unbearable, and therefore they need some sort of substance to make them feel better or to get over stressful periods or events in their life. And I'm interested in a little more information on how the way of thinking in RR helps you get around feelings, inappropriate levels of feelings that might lead you to believe that you need to use some sort of substance in order to alleviate your discomfort.
Okay, now, if a person does not have a depressive illness, now, we're talking about clinical depression, where a person is really unable to think very clearly and get straightened out. Generally, depression is a reflection of what people are thinking. People, for example, who think, life is hopeless, I'm a worm, and what's the use, are generating a feeling of depression. They may be looking at life and saying, well, I haven't done so well, and maybe things will stay this way, but in reality, there's a hopeless quality to the thinking itself. So rational recovery would help a person to start testing that idea. Is there any evidence that you will get no good in life, especially if you would stop drinking? Is there any evidence that you're a worm because your behavior was maybe wormy? If your behavior was rotten, does that mean that you're a stinker? Well, it doesn't add up when we hold it up to the test of reason. So the experience in rational recovery is that people learn to change their feelings of depression, especially guilt and anger and other negative emotions, by asking questions about what they are believing that causes them this emotional pain. This is quite different from the approach which is common with the 12-step approach, where it's felt that because of past events, my parents were alcoholic, my grandfather shot the lights out, and we had a dysfunctional family, so therefore I'm all screwed up today and I have to do my moral inventories and forever. That is a past orientation that we think is a waste of time, and we encourage people to reason aggressively against their own crooked thinking in order to defeat feelings of hopelessness or guilt or persistent anger.
And there's another difference there that I've heard a lot of people in the recovering community, there's been a lot of discussion that I've heard about debating the causes of alcoholism. Why did this happen to one individual and not to another? Does it have to do with family background, so and so? And I think that you would probably take the position that it doesn't matter because the solution is going to be the same regardless?
Precisely. Who the hell cares? The people who have a legitimate interest in whether it's a disease are scientists and maybe doctors and hospital administrators who get paid for treating disease. Now, they would like very much for it, I think, to be a disease from that angle. But if it's a disease, that doesn't help me in any way to know that. If it's not a disease, that doesn't help me. The job is the same, and people had better start recognizing that disease or not, if you're having persistent problems with the stuff, it's very important to either reduce it dramatically or get it out of your life altogether, which is what I did.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that this idea of the disease concept may allow, may provide a setup for people that continue to have problems to be able to say, well, this really isn't my fault because it's a disease and
well,
I'm powerless.
Mike, it's seductive to think that you have a disease that's making you drink. Now, people who drink a lot love to drink. I know I did. And when I heard this idea that I was powerless because I had a disease, my addictive voice in my head said, "Hooray, you finally figured it out. You're helpless. Break out the booze." Because now we have opened the door to endless, uncontrolled drinking when we admit this powerlessness disease idea. Now, you might ask, why is it then that everybody who admits that they're powerless, that they don't get worse, they get much better, that that's the first step to their recovery? Well, the root word of powerless is power, which leads to step number 2, which is higher power, which in step number 3 becomes God. So this is an induction process starting with powerlessness, where a person would surrender their intentional, voluntary control and behavior to some external authority, and then this authority, which is a kind, loving God who loves alcoholics, will provide character repairs, will give you strength in time of need, and be a very effective parent figure to keep us in control. So the powerlessness idea is basic and important and vital to people in AA. We wish them very well with that, but in our program, it's absolutely the worst thing to tell someone that they're powerless over their addiction. I think at any point in recovery, that would be a deadly idea to entertain, is that I'm somehow powerless over what I stick in my mouth.
Sure, and it's you try and get people used to the idea that they are very powerful, and that get that attitude initially so that they are able to apply the program in order to avoid these situations where they might have felt powerless.
The idea that we're powerful, I think if we just kind of remove that word, it doesn't seem to be quite relevant. What we are is competent. This is an area of human competency. And even if people are quite religious, and many people, by the way, do come to rational recovery, they're more comfortable because we are not religious, and it doesn't contradict with their own religion. But people who come into the program often enjoy the sense of being in control, I think is the main thing. Now, the idea that people would be powerful, I think that it's much better to have a sense that I'm responsible for what I'm doing.
Before we close here, I'd like to, I think you've kind of touched on the religion and AA issue, which is one that I'm sure you've had a lot of discussion about and that I've heard a lot about. And I think a lot of people that are checking out AA or just getting involved hear this a lot, that they're told that the only requirement to join AA is to have a sincere desire to quit drinking, and that once they start to detect some possibly spiritual or religious aspects of the program, and they start asking questions, that they're told that there's room for all sorts of beliefs within the program, and and it's not really a religious program, and
anything can be your higher power.
And I personally feel that there's a little bit of a deceptive approach to that going in. I'd be interested in what your reaction to that would be.
I'd say a little more than deception. This is a shuck and a jive. This is dishonest and disorienting to tell people that anything can be your higher power. See, by the time that this little technique starts, the person has already said, I don't get on to this God part. See, I'm having trouble with the God part. And so the response is, well, anything can be your higher power. It doesn't have to be God. Well, this is not honest, because it turns out to be God in step 3. And the idea that you can turn your life over to a teacup or a doorknob is absurd. People often do it because they're desperate. They're being approached at a time of special vulnerability and being offered this unsound basis to remain sober, and then later on, maybe a week later, saying, now it's time to turn your life over to the higher power of your choice. Well, what if it happens to be a tin can? See, the trouble is now we have to start blending in the attributes of a supreme being that loves alcoholics, or to sidestep the whole thing and say, well, let the group be your higher power. For myself, I think that turning my essential well-being over to a group of human beings is a folly, because they are imperfect, and really human beings are untrustworthy for what we can do for our own selves. When we have the competency, the idea of trusting others with our welfare is just a human folly.
Would it be accurate to say then that that you believe that combining the first step of convincing people that they're powerless, and then if you're dealing with somebody that doesn't have the religious inclination that are required in the later steps, might be kind of a dangerous combination for people that
many
get into that program?
many people do develop recovery group disorders as a result of that and other steps as well. Habitual relapsers, people who hang around AA meetings for 4, 5, 10 years, and they're drunk every other weekend. This is a recovery group disorder that we can attack and correct in rational recovery by teaching them addictive voice recognition training. So we're not powerless now. We are human beings who may recognize the thinking here up in the head that is necessary in order to ingest alcohol. For example, in order to get a beer down your throat, you have to think at least the word or have the picture in or the idea in your head of beer. Beer. Just to think that is the addictive voice. If you have to buy it, you have to know what brand you want, how much it costs, how many blocks it is, will I drive or walk. Very complicated thinking in order to get beer. This is the addictive voice that in rational recovery we learn to strike down and defeat, to domesticate it so that we can get on with our lives, not one day at a time, but for good. We can get rid of an addiction by choosing to forego all further use.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time here, so maybe you'd like to touch on the big plan idea versus the one day at a time concept.
One day at a time is a way of telling your addictive voice, no, I won't drink today. And the addictive voice just says, well, I'll check you out tomorrow when you might drink. In our residential and hospital settings, this is what we do. We teach people how to recognize the addictive voice so that when it pops up after they leave, they are prepared to recognize it and then deal with it in a very direct, self-preserving way.
Very interesting. Well, I think we just about need to wrap up, and I'll close by mentioning that Jack does have the small book, which should be available in local bookstores before too long.
Right now they are. Every bookstore has them.
They operate a residential rational recovery-based program in, is it Lotus, California?
Now it's in Lotus,
Okay.
and we have a new hospital in New Hampshire where people will have no further exposure to the 12 steps. People who have been through it and through it and through it are now being given a clean shot at taking personal responsibility for their futures.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for being here today, Jack. It was a pleasure to discuss this with you.
It's been a very pleasant discussion with you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.